My boss fired me at 10:42 a.m. on a Wednesday, right after his second espresso, right before the board's quarterly briefing, and just minutes before he would learn the most humiliating truth of his career. He had just terminated the majority owner of the entire company. Not symbolically. Not figuratively. Legally. On paper. 85% of the company was mine. And he didn't know. When he called me into his office, he had that smirk he saved for moments he thought made him powerful. The kind of smirk people wear when they don't realize they're standing on a trapdoor they built themselves. He didn't even close the blinds or lower his voice. He fired me like he was swatting a fly. He said my old-fashioned approach no longer fits the company's future and that he was ushering in a new era of modern leadership. Translation: he wanted my division, my budgets, my people, and he wanted me out of the way fast enough that I wouldn't see the mess he was about to make. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't remind him that the data infrastructure he bragged about every week was my design. Or that the biggest clients, the ones paying his salary several times over, worked exclusively with me because they didn't trust him. I didn't mention that the board had once considered firing him and replacing him with me. I just asked one quiet question: is this your final decision? He grinned wider. Yes. So I stood up, nodded, and walked out. He thought he'd crushed me. I could hear the swagger in his steps as he strutted back out to the floor and announced loudly that a new direction was coming. I think he fired 3 other people before lunch just to make the purge feel complete. Meanwhile, I drove home, made a sandwich, and waited for the board meeting. Because firing me didn't just bruise his ego, he had tripped a clause so catastrophic he couldn't possibly have known it existed. When I bought out the company years ago during a financial crisis, I allowed the former CEO to stay on the board under one condition: my ownership stake was never to be publicly announced. I didn't want to act as an owner. I wanted to work quietly, build the company, and know that if things ever spiraled, I'd have the power to protect the people who actually made the place run. That condition was locked behind legal agreements, and one particular trigger: if I was ever terminated without unanimous board consent, the majority owner, me, was required to conduct an immediate review of executive leadership. In plain English, he fired me, and in doing so, handed me the legal right to fire him. By 2:15 p.m., the board called an emergency session. By 2:17, they asked me to join via video. By 2:20, his face turned white as the chairwoman read the ownership breakdown he had clearly never seen. 85%. Mine. His eyes darted around the room like someone searching for a non-existent escape hatch. Then he stammered out an apology so clumsy and desperate it almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. He tried to claim it was a misunderstanding. That the firing wasn't official. That perhaps I had misinterpreted his words. But HR, in all their well-meaning efficiency, had already filed the paperwork, electronically, time-stamped, irreversible. The board asked me what I wanted to do. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply said, I want what's best for the company. At 3:04 p.m., they voted to remove him as CEO. At 3:07 p.m., his access badge deactivated. At 3:10 p.m., he was escorted out of the building, past the same employees he had mocked, belittled, and discarded all morning. By the next day, I signed the appointment papers naming a new CEO, the operations manager he once called dispensable. She cried in my office when I told her. Not out of fear, out of relief. As for me, I didn't retake my old job. I didn't need to. I still own the majority of the company, but I've stepped back, letting competent people run what I built. In every quarter since, profits have soared, employee turnover has plummeted, and the culture has healed. If there's a lesson here, it's simple: never fire the person you haven't bothered to understand. You never know who actually signs your paycheck. He tried to fight it, of course. Men like him never go quietly, not when they've built their image on the illusion of control. That night, he sent me 7 emails, all variations of "let's work this out and we can come to an agreement." His lawyer emailed me, too, trying to argue that I had concealed material ownership information. But that was the beauty of it. The original CEO, the board, the legal team, everyone had documented and approved the arrangement. Every signature was in place. Every clause was airtight. His own ignorance wasn't a defense. It was the core of the problem. The next morning, he tried something bolder. He showed up at headquarters before sunrise, demanding to speak to the board, claiming his termination was invalid. Security called me. I told them, calmly, that he was no longer employed, that he had no business on the property, and that they should treat him like any other ex-employee trespassing on company grounds. The guard later told me he stood there for 5 full minutes, stunned, as if the world had suddenly stopped obeying him. Then he left, shoulders slumped, like a man who only just realized the kingdom he thought he ruled was never his. Meanwhile, I called an all-hands meeting. Not the corporate kind filled with buzzwords and fake enthusiasm, just a straightforward gathering in the atrium. Hundreds of employees showed up, some curious, some nervous, many still reeling from the previous day's purge. I stepped up to the mic, not as an owner or executive, but as someone who had worked beside them for years. I told them 3 things. First, the firings were reversed immediately. Second, the culture of fear and favoritism was done, permanently. And third, the people who built this company would have a real voice in how it moved forward. There was no applause at first. Just silence. Then one person clapped. Then another. Then the whole room erupted, not into cheering, but into this low, emotional hum of relief. You could feel the tension finally draining out of the building. Over the next few weeks, everything we'd been held back from fixing, the outdated policies, the inflated executive bonuses, the broken workflows, finally got attention. Teams were empowered again. Managers who had thrived on intimidation quickly realized their days were numbered. And the company became stronger than it had been in a decade. He did try one last thing, a wrongful termination lawsuit. But when his lawyer read him the ownership documents, the firing clause, the time-stamped HR forms, and the board's unanimous vote, the case evaporated. I heard later that he'd gone to work for a much smaller firm in another state. A place where he wasn't in charge. A place where he actually had to listen to people. I sincerely hoped he learned something. But for my people, for the company, things only improved. Sometimes revenge isn't about crushing someone. Sometimes it's about restoring the balance they tried to break, and proving that real leadership never needed to shout to be heard. In the weeks that followed, people kept stopping by my office, some to thank me, some just to sit and talk for the first time in years without watching their words. The entire company felt like it was exhaling after holding its breath for far too long. Departments that had once been paralyzed by unnecessary approvals suddenly started moving again. The engineering team rolled out updates they'd been told weren't worth the budget. HR reversed 6 policies that had been instituted solely to give the former CEO more control. Finance found millions in waste that had been hidden under executive initiatives. The funniest part? Productivity jumped by nearly 40%. Apparently, when people aren't terrified of losing their jobs over the CEO's son waking up in a bad mood, they actually excel. Who knew? One morning, about a month into the turnaround, I walked past the lobby and saw the old photographs lining the wall, the founders, the early teams, the first office in a dusty strip mall. I remembered those days well. Back then, we built things with integrity because we didn't have anything else. Not money, not prestige. Just grit and trust. Somewhere along the way, the former CEO had forgotten that. Or maybe he never understood it at all. A few days later, the board called a meeting. Not the tense, high-stakes kind we used to have. This one felt almost hopeful. They sat me down and said the company hadn't been this healthy, this stable, or this optimistic in years. Then they asked me to take the role permanently. CEO. Not because I owned 85%. Not because I had leverage. But because they trusted me. I'll be honest, that meant more than any percentage of shares ever could. On my first official day, I didn't give a speech. I didn't send a company-wide email. I didn't do any of the theatrics leaders love so much. I just walked the floors, shook hands, and asked people what they needed to make their work better. That conversation, quiet, genuine, human, did more to shape the future of the company than any grand announcement ever would. And slowly but surely, the building felt different. Lighter. Safer. Like the place we used to dream of building. As for the former CEO, I don't think about him often. But every now and then, I hear a rumor, how he tried to start a consultancy and failed spectacularly, or how he blamed everyone but himself for losing a company he never actually understood. Revenge wasn't the goal. It was just the side effect of defending what mattered. In the end, the real victory wasn't firing him. It was proving that leadership rooted in fear collapses, but leadership rooted in people endures. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a regional leadership conference, nothing flashy, just a gathering of executives, founders, and department heads from companies around the state. Normally I would have declined. I've never been someone who enjoys spotlight or stage theatrics. But something in me said yes this time. Maybe because I finally had something worth saying. When I arrived, the room was buzzing with the usual business cliches, growth curves, scalable models, synergy. But the moment I stepped on stage, there was this quiet wave of recognition. People knew the story. They'd seen the headlines. They'd heard about a CEO being fired from his own company without realizing who actually controlled it. That kind of thing doesn't slip under the industry radar. I didn't go into details. I didn't name names. Instead, I talked about something simple, how power blinds people when they stop listening. And how companies rot from the top down when leadership treats loyalty as servitude instead of partnership. You could feel the room shift. Executives leaned forward. HR heads scribbled notes. Younger managers stared like they were hearing something forbidden yet necessary. Afterward, people lined up to shake my hand or pull me aside quietly. I've got someone like that at my company. You made me rethink how I lead. I wish my boss could hear this. That was the moment I realized something important. What happened to me wasn't just personal, it was common. Too common. And the mistake my old CEO made wasn't firing me. It was mistaking fear for control. One night, a little while after the conference, I stayed late in my office. Everyone had gone home, lights dim, hallways silent. I walked past the glass wall overlooking the city, the same view he once bragged about from his corner office. Back then, I stood on the other side of it. Now, the chair behind the glass was mine. But here's the difference, I didn't cling to it. I respected it. Because real leadership isn't about owning the view. It's about seeing the people who help you reach it. Before I left, I looked around the empty room and realized something that finally settled everything in my chest. He fired me thinking he was removing a nuisance. Instead, he handed the company back to the person who cared enough to save it. And he never got it back. Some endings feel like victories. This one felt like justice, quiet, steady, and earned. A few weeks later, we had our first full quarterly review under the new leadership structure. It wasn't in a fancy boardroom with crystal water pitchers and people pretending to be more important than they were. I moved the meeting to the Commons area, the big open space where the company held holiday parties back in the early days. People were nervous at first. They weren't used to sitting in the same circle as executives. They weren't used to being asked real questions. They definitely weren't used to being heard. But slowly, the tension faded. A junior analyst spoke up about a budgeting bottleneck that had been hurting her team for years. A senior engineer admitted that he'd been afraid to propose a bold redesign because the old CEO didn't like surprises. A project manager said the most shocking thing of all: we'd forgotten what it felt like to care. Not one person in that room talked about profit. Not one mentioned stock prices. They talked about purpose, about frustration, about hope. It hit me like a punch in the chest. This wasn't a company that needed a hero. It needed a leader who remembered they were people. After the meeting ended, I found myself alone in the empty room again. It reminded me of how many nights I'd spent here over the years, staying late not because anyone asked me to, but because I believed in what we were building. Back then, the CEO mocked that. He called it sentimental inefficiency. Funny how sentiment turned out to be the thing that saved the place. A few days after that, an envelope arrived on my desk with no return address. Inside was a short handwritten note: "You got the company I never deserved. I hope you do better with it than I ever could." It wasn't an apology. He wasn't built for that. But it was acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement is the closest some people can get to remorse. I placed the note in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder of how quickly power can warp someone when they forget the value of the people beneath them. A reminder of how close this place came to collapsing under ego. And a reminder that I was now responsible for keeping it from ever happening again. Months turned to a year. Revenue climbed higher than any quarter under the previous CEO. Employee turnover dropped to almost zero. The board extended my contract by unanimous vote, again. But the win that meant the most came one afternoon when an intern, barely 20, nervous, holding a laptop like a shield, knocked on my door and said, "Hey, I know you're busy, but could I get your opinion on something I'm building?" I knew right then the culture had changed. People weren't afraid anymore. They trusted the door would stay open. And that's when it truly hit me: the final revenge wasn't that I got the corner office. It wasn't that I owned 85%. It wasn't even that he lost everything after firing the one person he couldn't afford to lose. The real revenge, the real victory, was that the company he almost destroyed finally became the company it was always meant to be. Stronger. Kinder. Human. Exactly the kind of place he never wanted, and exactly the kind of place I always believed it could become. About a year and a half later, I was invited to speak at a university's business leadership program. I almost declined. Public speaking still wasn't my favorite thing, but one of our interns, now a full-time engineer, had come from that school. She told me, they need to hear from someone who actually leads, not someone who just manages. So I went. The auditorium was packed with students in worn-out hoodies, professors with too many books under their arms, and a few local business leaders who probably came for networking more than learning. When I walked on stage, I noticed a poster behind me with a quote from some famous CEO about commanding excellence through authority. I couldn't help but smile. Authority. That word, so misunderstood. When it was my turn to speak, I told them a story. Not the dramatic version the media loved, but the real one: how I'd spent years believing talent alone would protect me. How I didn't realize until too late that ego at the top can erase decades of loyalty in minutes. And how getting fired turned out to be the best thing that ever happened, for me and eventually for the company. Afterward, a line of students formed. One asked me how to prevent executives like that from taking advantage. Another asked how someone without power could protect themselves. A third asked if I regretted not fighting back sooner. My answer was the same for all of them: you can't control other people's character. but you can control whether you let their decisions define you. On the flight home, I thought about everything that had changed. Not the money, not the title, not the board seat. Those mattered, sure, but they weren't the real milestones. The real milestones were smaller, quieter, watching a junior employee lead a meeting without fear. Seeing teams argue passionately because they knew their ideas would be heard, not punished. Hearing laughter in hallways that had once felt like funeral homes. Watching leaders rise from within instead of being installed from above. One evening, well after midnight, I walked the empty floors again, something that had become a habit. The old CEO used to obsess over the image of power. He spent more time posing in glass offices than actually improving the company. Me? I liked the silence. I liked seeing the desks where ideas were born. The whiteboards covered in scribbles. The half-empty coffee cups that meant someone stayed late because they wanted to, not because they were terrified not to. That night, I ended up standing in front of the old CEO's framed portrait, the one the board insisted we keep for historical continuity. His smile looked strained, confident in a way only the untouchable ever seemed to be. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I noticed the plaque beneath it. It had always read, "Under his leadership, we grew." Someone, quietly, anonymously, had placed a small handwritten sticky note over it. On it was written, "But under yours, we thrive." I didn't remove it. I didn't mention it. I just stood there for a moment, letting it settle. Because the truth was simple, he fired me thinking he was removing a threat. But all he did was remove the one person holding the place together. And when the dust settled, the company chose who it wanted to follow, not because of ownership, or fear, or hierarchy, but because they finally felt seen. In the end, my revenge wasn't a single moment. It was every day the company grew healthier without him. Every day people walked in without dread. Every day someone dared to speak, innovate, challenge, build. Every day this place became a testament to what leadership should be. Quiet. Steady. Human. And that, more than anything he ever chased, is what lasts. A few months later, I found myself sitting in the corner of a conference room during a leadership workshop our HR team had organized. Normally, CEOs don't sit in, but I'd made it a rule early on to keep my ear close to the ground. You can't fix a culture if you never stand where the culture actually lives. The room was filled with department heads and team leads. Coffee cups everywhere. Sticky notes on every wall. A low hum of chatter as people traded small frustrations and big ambitions. It felt alive. Something it had never been under the old regime. Then one of the facilitators said, "Let's talk about trust. Who here feels like leadership finally listens?" Hands went up. Not hesitant hands. Not cautious hands. Hands lifted with the kind of certainty that only comes after long droughts. I didn't speak, I only listened. And what they described wasn't perfection. It wasn't some utopian workplace where everything was magical. They talked about disagreements, messy rollouts, deadlines that needed pushing. But beneath all of it was this constant refrain, "At least we feel like we matter now." Those words hit me harder than any applause, any article, any boardroom victory ever could. After the workshop ended, a woman from finance, someone who had barely made eye contact with me during my old firing, walked up. She held a notebook, but her hands weren't shaking the way they used to around upper management. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "When you were fired, we all thought the company was lost. People were ready to quit in batches. But when you came back, it felt like hope walked back in. I appreciated it, but I didn't dwell on praise. That's a trap too many leaders fall into." Still, hearing it was a reminder of how much culture shapes everything. A few weeks later, the old CEO resurfaced in the news. Some consulting job. some keynote speech at an event that loved buzzwords more than real results. A journalist reached out to me for a comment on his career reboot. I declined. Because the story was never about him anymore. One crisp morning, I arrived at the office early, sun barely up, hallway still dark, and I saw something odd near reception. A series of framed photographs lined the wall, milestones, team events, product launches. Someone had rearranged the layout, and in the center was a new frame with a candid shot of the entire staff during our last anniversary celebration. Everyone was laughing, leaning on one another, confetti mid-air. Below the photo was a simple engraved line: "The company belongs to those who build it." No signatures. No attribution. No ego. Just truth. I stood there longer than I care to admit. Not because I saw myself in that picture, I didn't, actually. I was off to the side, half hidden, arms crossed, smiling like someone who didn't need the spotlight. But because I saw what the company had become. And what it would never again be. That afternoon, during an all-hands meeting, I gave the shortest speech I'd ever given. "We're not trying to be perfect," I said. "We're trying to be better than yesterday. And so far, you're all doing one hell of a job." The applause wasn't loud, it was warm. Genuine. The kind that fills the room without trying to dominate it. Later, as I walked back to my office, I realized something quietly profound. Revenge had never really been the point. Reclaiming the place and rebuilding the people inside it was. The old CEO chased power until it slipped through his fingers. I chased purpose. And in doing so, I gained something far more lasting: a company that no longer needed fear to move forward. A team that no longer flinched at opportunity. A culture that no longer bowed to ego. And a legacy, not of force, or ownership, or dominance, but of resilience. A legacy they helped me build. And one they would all carry long after I was gone. His story didn't really end there, of course. Companies don't tie themselves up neatly like movies do. They breathe. They shift. They reveal their old faults and their new strengths in unexpected moments. About 6 months after the board reinstated me, we landed a partnership with an international firm we'd been chasing for nearly a decade. Not because of some flashy pitch deck or because I waved around my ownership stake like a badge, but because, when their executives toured our operations, they saw something rare: people who genuinely loved their work again. One of their directors pulled me aside during the visit and said, "Everyone here seems awake. Like they're not just working, they're participating." I smiled. That was the point. But the real twist didn't come from competitors or clients. It came from within. One afternoon, I was reviewing quarterly forecasts when HR pinged me. "Emergency situation in the lobby. You might want to come down." When I stepped out of the elevator, I saw him. The former CEO. Standing in the entrance like a ghost trying to re-enter the world of the living. His hair was grayer, his posture wasn't as certain, and the trademark smugness had cracked into something more fragile: confusion, maybe even regret. He cleared his throat. "I was hoping we could talk." The receptionist looked at me, waiting for instructions. Employees in the lobby had paused mid-step, pretending not to stare. I walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "What exactly do you want to talk about?" I asked. He hesitated. "About coming back. Not as CEO," he added quickly, "just contributing. Offering experience. Helping the company I built." There it was, the line he'd always believed: I built this. For a moment, I studied him. This was a man who once thought every employee was replaceable except himself. A man who fired me without reading a single detail of what he'd signed away. A man who thought leadership was a throne instead of a responsibility. And now he was asking for a seat anywhere at all. I wasn't cruel. But I wasn't naive either. "This company isn't what you left," I said calmly. "People here don't work under fear anymore. They don't hide their ideas, and they don't shrink to make executives feel tall." His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in a slow realization. "So that's it?" he asked. "No place for me?" I shook my head gently. "Not in this version of the company. The one you built is gone. And frankly, it needed to be." He looked around the lobby, at the smiling employees, the open workspaces, the buzz of energy he never managed to create, and he understood. Truly understood. Not because I said it, but because he could see it. "Good luck," he whispered, almost to himself, and walked out. No theatrics. No final jab. No grand exit. Just a man stepping away from something that had outgrown him. When I returned to my office, my COO walked in and asked, "Are you okay?" I nodded. "Yeah. That needed to happen." She smiled. "Closure?" "Not exactly." I leaned back in my chair. "Evolution." Because the real revenge, the lasting, undeniable kind, was never about humiliation. It was this: he left behind a company that worshipped authority. I rebuilt one that valued people. He clung to control until it broke him. I let go of ego and watched the whole organization rise. And in the end, he returned looking for relevance, while the company he once ruled had moved confidently into a future where it no longer needed him. That wasn't victory. That was transformation. And transformation always outlives the person who tries to stop it. I didn't expect the next twist to come from the board. A week after the former CEO showed up in the lobby, the chairwoman invited me to an off-site retreat for senior leadership. Every department head was there, from operations to legal to engineering. Even the new interns had been mentioned in the welcome packet, symbolic of how inclusive the culture had become. But halfway through the second day, she pulled me aside and said, "There's something we need to share with you. It's about the ownership structure." My first thought was, did we uncover some leftover legal problem from the old regime? Not quite. She handed me a sealed folder. Inside was a printed resolution, unanimous signatures of the entire board. They weren't just renewing my contract. They were offering me full executive control of strategic decisions. Not because of my ownership percentage. Not because of the revenge arc everyone quietly admired from a distance. Not because the company needed a hero. But because they wanted a leader who didn't need a spotlight. I stared at the document for a long moment. "You're sure about this?" I asked. She nodded. "You rebuilt the culture. You stabilized the financials. You restored trust. The truth is, the company would have died under the old mindset." It was strange. I'd been fired once without warning, overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. And now the people who truly understood the company's trajectory were handing me the reins in broad daylight, no drama attached. Later that evening, after the meetings wrapped, I stepped outside to breathe in the cool air. The hotel overlooked a quiet lake, its surface smooth and reflective under the dim lights strung along the walkway. My COO joined me after a moment. "So," she said casually, "you gonna accept it?" I exhaled slowly. "I'm not sure." She raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Yeah." I kept my eyes on the lake. I didn't rebuild this place to become the next untouchable CEO. You've seen what happens when power becomes a personal trophy. She nodded thoughtfully. "You're afraid of becoming him." "Exactly." There was a pause, then she smiled, really smiled. "Then don't. Be something different." I laughed under my breath. "And what does that look like?" Simple, she said, leaning on the railing beside me. Share power. Mentor leaders. Build teams that challenge you. Create systems that don't fall apart if you step away. If you ever feel irreplaceable, that's a sign you're failing. Her words hit harder than she probably expected. Maybe because they were true. Maybe because they were exactly the opposite of what the former CEO lived by. Maybe because I realized my fear was just another form of pride in disguise. I took a deep breath and made the decision. I'll accept, I said quietly. But on my terms. We build a leadership structure that doesn't center around a single person. Not me, not anyone. She clapped me on the shoulder. Now that, she said, sounds like the future. A future built not on revenge, but on resilience. Not on replacing one tyrant with another, but on eliminating the need for one altogether. And the best part? A month later, during a quarterly company-wide meeting, someone asked me what the biggest lesson was from being fired by the man who never realized I owned the company he thought he controlled. I didn't brag. I didn't gloat. I didn't take a victory lap. I just said, if a company relies too much on one person, good or bad, it's a failure waiting to happen. Our strength is what we build together. That's our insurance policy. That's our legacy. The room stayed quiet for a heartbeat, and then erupted into applause. In the end, revenge wasn't the story. Survival was. Reinvention was. Leadership, the real kind, was. And while the former CEO disappeared into the shadows of his own ego, the company he tried to rule from a throne became something better, a place where no one had to fear being replaced. Because everyone was growing. Everyone mattered. Everyone had a voice. Funny how the best revenge sometimes looks nothing like revenge at all. In the months that followed, the company finally became what it should have been all along, innovative, transparent, and built on actual merit instead of ego. Departments that once hid problems out of fear began proposing solutions. Young engineers who used to whisper ideas in break rooms now led workshops. And for the first time in decades, the board saw growth built on stability instead of bluff. One afternoon, as I walked through the renovated operations floor, someone stopped me just to say thank you. Not for saving the company. Not for the ownership reveal. But for changing the culture from survive your boss to build something worthwhile. That moment meant more to me than any revenge I could have taken. The old CEO never returned, his legacy collapsing under the weight of his own decisions. Meanwhile, this place, the one he tried to rule like a kingdom, thrived without him. Because leadership isn't about titles or power. It's about responsibility. And responsibility, once embraced instead of abused, creates something no firing, no betrayal, no arrogance can destroy. Looking back, losing my job was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced the truth into the open. It gave me clarity. And it proved one thing beyond any doubt: some people chase control. Some people fear losing it. But the ones who build systems that outlive them, the ones who lift others instead of stepping on them, those are the people who actually win. And in the end, that was my real victory.